I want you, if you will, to get in your mind a gracious 86-year-old man. He's facing death, and he's not laying on a comfortable bed surrounded by his friends and family. He's actually at the center of a pile of dry wood with his hands tied behind his back, surrounded by a jeering mob. And what's interesting about him, not just that he's 86 years old and in this position, but what's interesting is when you look at him, he's just so full of peace. Polycarp was the bishop of the church in Smyrna. His crime was not murder, his crime was not sedition, his crime was faith. He wasn't sentenced to death for what he had done, he was sentenced to death for what he refused to do, and that was bow down and worship Caesar as Lord. He was really a loved and revered pastor. In fact, he was a disciple, a student of John the Apostle. When they brought him to be burned at the stake because he refused to quit preaching and quit proclaiming the name of Christ, the Roman governor, the proconsul, encouraged him, at least for his age. He said, look, at your age, have respect for your old age, swear and reproach the name of Christ, and I'll set you free. Polycarp answered these words, I quote, 86 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. 86 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my King and my Savior? You threaten me with the fire that burns for an hour and then is extinguished, but you know nothing of the fire of the coming judgment and the eternal punishment reserved for the ungodly. They started to nail him to the stake, and he actually asked them not to nail him to the stake. He said, the same one that gives me strength to endure the first will enable me not to struggle without the help of your nails. So they tied his hands behind his back, and they lit the fire. Right before lighting the fire, though, Polycarp prayed a powerful prayer, and it was almost humorous because in his prayer he again proclaims the name of Jesus. Historical accounts report that when the fire was lit, it actually, and there were many people there to see this happen, it actually seemed like it didn't even touch his body. One eyewitness said that the flames didn't really seem to engulf him. Instead of smelling the smell of burnt flesh, they said it was like a sweet frankincense or a perfume that hung in the air. It was interesting, the fire couldn't even kill the old man, and when they seen that the fire wouldn't kill him, the executioner was ordered to stab him, so he stabbed him, and so much blood came out that it actually put the fire out. Polycarp died that day from the wound, not from the fire. I want to pose this question this morning. What moves a man to such dedication, especially an 86-year-old man? What would move that kind of man to such dedication that he would be willing to actually sacrifice his life? And the answer has to be to that question that he had found something to live for that was literally worth dying for. As we look at the second of these 7 churches in this series, Letters from Home, I want us to put ourselves in the position of the Smyrna church this morning. I want us to ask ourselves the honest question, not just ask, but really try to answer to ourselves, is Jesus worth this to me? Is Jesus worth everything to me? If I was called to actually lay down, to give my life for Him, would I count it a horror or an honor? The questions were, the Smyrnans were literally facing this question. As we've already talked about this morning, there are believers around the world this morning who are going to literally give their final breath for Jesus. And just by their testimony, just by what we know is going on, it has to force us to stop and ask ourselves, would we honestly do the same thing? Revelation chapter 2, we pick up with this second church. Jesus writes to the church in Smyrna, to the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, these things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. I know your works, tribulation, and poverty, but you're rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. You will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Verse 11, Jesus closes the letter. He says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. I want to divide this letter from Jesus to the church into 4 headings today that we're going to look at to kind of order our study. I want us to look at the prelude, the persecution, the promise, and the prophecy. And of course, I am Baptist, and they will be alliterated. Let's begin this morning by looking at the prelude. The Scripture tells us that we've already looked through these letters, and we've spent several weeks in the first chapter. We know that this is written from God Himself, from the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. But I want you to notice again and again, Jesus signs the letters at the beginning rather than the end. And that's important because knowing who the letter is from is as important, if not more important, than what it has to say. Here, this letter, we're told, is from verse 8, we're told this letter is from the first and the last. Now, I want to put this in kind of historical context here. This description would have been significant to the Smyrna believers. Smyrna is now, you see, just above Ephesus, just north of Ephesus. Smyrna is now the Turkish city of Izmir. It was considered, this is a graphic, this is not an actual picture, but this is a graphic of what the city probably looked like. It was considered first in beauty out of all the cities in the Asian province of Rome. If one looked at this city from a distance, this picture is kind of taken or drawn from the view of the Acropolis. That was the high mountain with a temple set on the top. If one looked at this city from a distance, the Acropolis, seated at the top of Mount Pegasus, actually appeared like a shimmering crown against the backdrop of the rising and the setting sun. Literally, for good reason, Smyrna was known as the crown jewel of Asia Minor. Ephesus may have been the commercial center, but Smyrna was the cultural center of the province. She was known for three things: her wealth, her wine, and her wonder. There was no city in all of Asia Minor more beautiful than Smyrna. She was first in beauty. But she was not only first in beauty, she was first in faithfulness. The citizens of Smyrna claimed their city to be the first city that actually erected a temple to Caesar. Once a year, every citizen, without exception, was required to offer a frankincense offering to Caesar and to declare loyalty, actually to say Caesar is Lord. Anybody who refused to make that offering and say Caesar is Lord would be excommunicated and probably executed. Smyrna was first in beauty in Rome. It was first in loyalty in Rome as far as the Asian province goes. But Christ here reminds the church, He says, I am the true first and the true last of all things. Besides me, there is no God, not even Caesar. God had given Himself this title in Isaiah 44:6. The Lord said, I'm the King of Israel and His Redeemer, the Lord of hosts. God said, I am the first and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God, and that includes Caesar. From the opening lines, Christ is reminding His people that He and He alone is first in beauty, and besides Him, there is no God, not even Caesar. He not only reminded them that He alone was the first and the last, He also described Himself as the one who was dead and came to life. I love that word, just that word was. Jesus is the only one that can say, by the way, I'm the one that was dead. He said, I'm the one who was dead and came to life. Again, this is going to be particularly meaningful to not just the Smyrna believers, but to the city. Smyrna was a city that, as it had been said, rose from the dead. It was destroyed and rebuilt by its citizens. Now, the people of Smyrna were so proud that they refused any federal, financial, or physical aid to help rebuild the city. They rebuilt the city with their own hands. But here Christ reminds the church in this reborn city, this city that's so proud. He says, look, I did more than reconstruct broken walls. I died a mortal death and I rose an immortal life. This city was destroyed, but in truth, the city wasn't dead because the city has no life in itself. However, I actually ceased to live. My heart stopped. Rigor mortis set in, and yet I rose again by the power of the Spirit. This that He's saying to the church, I'm the one who was dead and yet is alive. This is going to be especially meaningful to the church at Smyrna. To the church, Jesus said, your city claims the title, the first and the last, the one who is dead. But Jesus says, your city claims these titles, but I alone possess these titles. That's the prelude, the opening of the letter. Number 2, I want you to see the persecution. Verse 9, Jesus says to the church, I know your works, your tribulation, your poverty, but you're rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. See, these Christians here were under severe pressure. In fact, the word tribulation literally means trouble, burden, or pressure. The church in Smyrna was living in a proverbial pressure cooker, if you want to put it that way. Think about their circumstances for a moment. Kind of put yourself in their shoes. The government demanded complete loyalty, even to the point of worship. In the name of tolerance, the culture demanded that they loosen up their convictions, that they get with the times. Yet even under this massive amount of pressure, this church had not bent. This church had not buckled. And Jesus himself recognizes it. I love that Jesus says to the church in Smyrna, I know your works. I know as a pastor, sometimes I may focus too much on God seeing our sin. But I want to remind you this morning, it's encouraging. God doesn't just see our sin, God sees our faithfulness. He sees our good as well as our bad. And to these believers who are enduring hardness as good soldiers for His name's sake, I love it that Jesus just says, I see you. I mean, what a sweet consolation it must have been for these suffering believers to hear Jesus say, I know what you're going through. Don't think I've forgotten. I know the pressure you're under, and I just want you to know I'm proud of you for standing strong. Isn't that just the most desirable thing that you could hear when you stand before Jesus? Is for Him to say, I'm proud of you. The pressure was great. Their poverty was great as well. Notice Jesus said, I know not only your works and your tribulation, I know your poverty. There are two primary Greek words that we translate poverty into English. One means having little, the other means having nothing at all. The word that Jesus uses here is the word for having nothing at all. Now, it's worth asking, why would citizens of such a prosperous city be so poor? And I think the answer is obvious. Remember, they refused to worship the emperor, and it's likely that their refusal caused them to find it difficult to make a living, especially to making a living in an economy where the economic system was directly tied to the state. To be identified as a Christian in Smyrna was like being marked as a Jew in Germany. Therefore, to do business with or even pity, to even try to help a Christian, probably meant that you would suffer the same thing they suffered. In this kind of economic environment, no businessman in his right mind would ever hire a Christian. Nobody would trade with a Christian. Nobody would collaborate with a Christian. And you remember, Jesus specifically said that they had nothing. It's reasonable to assume that their homes were probably seized. Their assets had probably been liquidated by the government. This church knew through personal experience what it meant to suffer for the cause of Christ. Literally, they had lost everything for the name of Jesus. You know, I just thought this week as I was preparing, it is so easy to say, I'll give my whole life to Christ. It's another thing altogether when you're called to sacrifice your whole livelihood, isn't it? Let me ask you, if you were today, and I don't know that any of us could wholly answer this until we're faced with that moment, but if you were today called to compromise your convictions or lose your job, would it be a difficult choice? If you were called today to blaspheme or go broke, what would you do? The question, I think, was settled for the Smyrnans by the fact that their security was not found in a job, their security was found in Jesus. The fact that the Smyrnans were so poor is itself evidence that they chose God over gold. There's a paradox that shows here, though. Yes, their poverty is obvious, but notice Jesus says, but you're rich. Now, that doesn't even make any sense after everything I've just said. Honestly, it doesn't make sense, but I think Paul captured what Jesus meant when he said in 2 Corinthians 6:10 as having nothing and yet possessing all things. The Smyrnans had nothing, yet at the same time they had everything. They may have lacked earthly treasures, but they were rich in the allowances of heaven. But when I say they were rich, I don't just mean in spiritual blessings. It was not just spiritual blessings alone that Christ referred to. And whether they understood it or even whether their persecutors understood it, everything in Smyrna belonged to this little church. The Smyrnans had a secret, and that's that their inheritance made the assets of the empire's wealthiest men look like chump change. They might have needed to be reminded of it. Yes, things may look bad, but really the fact is you are rich. As joint heirs with Christ, they were set to inherit all that Jesus himself will one day inherit. And what will Jesus inherit? Everything. Literally everywhere the Smyrnans turned their eyes, they were looking at things that belonged to them. Can I tell you something? Even you may be poor, you may struggle as a believer, and this is not some prosperity gospel, this is the reality. You may struggle as a believer on this earth, but take heart, look around you, because Jesus says, look around you, everything you see belongs to me, therefore it belongs to you. You may seem poor, but you're rich. Take heart. Though we may not yet possess it, God has promised to give us an inheritance that is undefiled, unfading, and incorruptible. We may look poor, but looks can be deceiving, can't they? Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 10, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." In this city, they weren't just facing the problems of their poverty, but they had a very real group of persecutors who were out to get them. It's interesting that the people who tend to rise to the top here as their persecutors are not the Romans, not the Greeks. The people that rise to the top as their persecutors are the religious people. The Jews saw the Christian faith not as a completion of their religion, but as competition. To them, Jews were traitors who became believers, if you will. And notice Jesus said, "I know the blasphemy." So I don't just know what's going on with you. I know what's going on with them. I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. I think the blasphemy that Jesus was probably referring to here related to the Jews' practice of slandering the church before the authorities. There were two primary ways that the Jews would slander the church. First, they would often accuse them of being atheists. Now, I know that makes no sense, but they would accuse them of being atheists because of their refusal to worship Caesar. In fact, when Polycarp was burned at the stake, right before being burnt, the proconsul, the governor, said to him, "Look, if you will just say, 'Down with the atheist,' I'll let you go." Polycarp, in the way that only an 86-year-old man with a sense of humor could, turned to the crowd and said, "Down with the atheist," as they jeered to have him killed. The Jews would say they're atheists because they won't worship Caesar, when in reality they were the farthest thing from atheists. Not only did they accuse them of being atheists, they would also accuse them of cannibalism because of their observance of the Lord's Supper. There was this man who came to our church at one point, and he made a profession of faith, and he was living out of his vehicle, had a lot of stuff going on, and we were trying to help him. We told him to start reading in the book of John, start reading the Bible in the book of John. Well, my dad went over one day and found out he's packing up, because he was actually staying on the church property. We eventually made a little room for him there on the church property. My dad went over and found out he was packing up stuff. He was ready to leave. My dad asked him, "What's going on?" And he said, "I read in that book of John like you told me to." He said, "And that book's full of cannibalism, talking about eating flesh and drinking blood." And my dad tried to explain it to him, and then he said, "And two, it wants me to drink wine, and I got sugar diabetes. I can't drink no wine." I know to the outside world why it may seem confusing. We know what we're talking about when we talk about eating flesh and drinking blood. What the Jews would do, they would take that language and they would take it to the government and say, "Look, they're cannibals." When Polycarp was actually burnt, this is eyewitness testimony that it was the Jews who were foremost in helping to gather the branches for the fire. What's interesting about that is Polycarp was burnt on a Saturday. That's the Sabbath day. It's interesting that the Jews were willing to break their own law in order to burn a believer. The Jews prided themselves on their belief in the one true God, yet what they proved is they didn't know Him because they rejected Jesus. Jesus said, "Look, if you were of the world would love its own." But He said, "Yet because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you." Remember the word that I said to you, a servant's not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. Can you think of anyone that hated Jesus more than the Jews? And what's interesting is this church in Smyrna here is experiencing exactly what Jesus experienced, because they are being persecuted by the Jews, and the persecution of the Jews is leading to trial by the Romans. Can I just say to you, don't be surprised if the world, and when I say the world, I include the religious system, the religious elites, don't be surprised if the world hates you if you love Christ. In fact, I think we should honestly be more bothered if the world loves us than when the world hates us. That doesn't mean we go around trying to stir up trouble. That doesn't mean that we try to be persecuted. No. But if we are living faithful to the Word of God, if we are truly loving Jesus through our actions, through our deeds, if we're truly loving Him, the world is going to hate us for that. The Jews hated the church because they loved the darkness, and the church was what? A candlestick. The light always reveals what's in the darkness. The church's love and loyalty to Jesus was literally a slap in the face to the Jews because it revealed their lack of love, their lack of loyalty to God. These words that Christ used to the Jews is really quite severe. Listen to this. He says, "I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not." Literally, he says, look, as far as I'm concerned, they're not even Jews. These are not the true seed of Abraham. They've aligned themselves with Rome, and in doing so, they have become the enemies of God. I think it's interesting that Jesus goes so far as to call their gathering place, their meeting house, their church house, if you will. He calls it a synagogue of Satan. That's a different message, but that says a lot about what Jesus thinks about false religion, doesn't it? To these believers, hated on every side, Jesus says, I know what you're going through. And of course, this was not just in the sense of having knowledge, but in the sense of sharing their experience. Jesus knew what it was. Think about this. Jesus knew what it was to be persecuted by the Jews and the Romans alike. Jesus knew what it was to be an outsider to the religious elites. He knew what it was to be mocked by those who called themselves true and undefiled religion. He could say, I understand the pressure of compromise for a piece of bread. Remember, I was out in the wilderness and I felt that. He could say, I get poverty because I didn't even have a place to lay my head. They've taken your house. I get that. He could say, I know what it's like to be rejected by my own people. The Jews lied about me as well as they're lying about you. They slander my name just like they're slandering yours. They misrepresented me before the Romans just like they've misrepresented you. And Jesus says to this suffering church, if you're poor, if you're persecuted, if you're in pain, I know how you feel, and I am near to those who have a broken heart. There is no suffering the church faces that Christ has not himself first endured. Please hear me in this. Jesus will call you to nothing that he himself has not been through first. He is present with his bride in her trouble. Our consolation is that not only did he suffer for us, but Jesus suffers with us to be to the persecuted church. Jesus says, I know what you're going through. Thirdly, I want you to see the prophecy that Jesus makes to the church. In verse 10, Christ informed the church that there was more trouble on the horizon. Now look, this is a church that's already hurting. This is a church that's already lost everything. And then Jesus says, by the way, there's more coming. But I want you to notice he begins not with what will happen, but what their response should be. Verse 10, he says, do not fear any of those things which you're about to suffer. You look all through the Old Testament, he said it to Joshua, I think he said it to Jacob. God's message to his people has always been, be not afraid because I'm with you. You know what interests me here? Jesus says to these people in Smyrna, don't be afraid of any of the things which you're about to suffer. The word suffer is not pretty, it's not attractive, but Jesus can say, be not afraid of it. To anything we go through, Jesus can say, don't be afraid of it, because Jesus also says, I'm with you. And I am with you. My grace will always be sufficient to you. That's enough. His sufficiency will be enough in our suffering. If you wonder, if I'm ever called to actually suffer for Jesus, will I be able to handle it? That's the wrong question. The question is, will Jesus be able to handle it? His sufficiency, His grace will be sufficient in the time that we're called to suffer. In the remainder of verse 10, Jesus explains exactly what is about to happen. He says, indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. It shouldn't be missed that Jesus specifically says their coming suffering is going to be initiated by Satan himself. I love this though. Even the devil, even though that's true, Jesus is not lying here, yet even the devil's activity, though, we're going to see is subject to God's sovereignty. When he says that they'll be tried, he's not referring just to a judicial trial. He's referring to the testing of the genuineness of their faith. Now think about this. In the Roman Empire, for us, prison is a sentence. It wasn't so in the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, prison basically served two purposes, coercion or holding. It was a way for the government to strong-arm you into doing what they wanted you to, or it was where they held you until they were able to execute you. For any true believers, they knew that when Jesus said, you're going to be thrown into prison, they knew for a true believer that prison was the prelude to death. I think this is the testing that Jesus is speaking of. Anyone think about this, and we know the church has many in it who are not true sheep, who are really not following Jesus, who really don't love Jesus, who don't know Jesus. But anyone who's not truly committed to Jesus, anyone who is like that in the church of Smyrna, would not die for this faith they didn't believe in. The threat of incarceration, the threat of execution would be enough to divide the sheep and the goats. This trial by fire was God's way of testing and proving the genuineness of their individual faith. Again, though, what the devil meant to reduce the church, God was using to refine the church. We can be confident even in suffering. When the devil is trying to tear the church down, God is busy building it up. He said, the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. What Satan meant for evil, God was using for good. And I think there's no greater illustration of this than Calvary itself. In trying to destroy the Redeemer, Satan actually was the one who, in essence, brought about redemption. When the serpent sank his teeth into Jesus' heel, Jesus dropped his foot and crushed the serpent's head. One would think the devil would learn after the cross that every time he tries to attack God, he actually furthers the agenda of God. One would think that he would learn every time Satan attempts to put out the light, he's really just throwing fuel on the fire. Remember, Tertullian said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Whenever the church is persecuted, the church always grows. That's why the church in the Middle East, the church in China, the church in North Korea, the number one nation for persecution in the world, that's why those churches are booming. Not with buildings, not with big offerings, not with fancy things. They are booming in actual converts because their faith is being tested. People are seeing the genuineness of their faith, and people are coming to Christ because of it. See what the devil meant for evil. The devil's going to throw you into prison, but God said, don't worry about that. Christ's word to His church was, some of you are going to be arrested, some of you are going to be thrown in jail. Furthermore, you will suffer there for 10 days. Now, there's a lot of different opinions by a lot of different commentators what 10 days means. I want to give you my interpretation. It's deep. I think when He says here 10 days, He means 10 days. I don't know why we always have to make everything figurative. I think Jesus is actually saying, you're going to be in jail for 10 days. You're going to be in jail for 10 days, and the implication is you're going to be incarcerated for 10 days. The implication of that is then you're going to be executed. I have no doubt when this letter was read on the Lord's Day, the church gathered on Sunday, and the pastor of the church, the angel, the messenger stood up and said, this is the letter we've got from John. He's on Patmos, and this is actually what Jesus has to say to us. Can you imagine how the people started looking at each other when he got to the part where he said, look, I know you've already suffered a lot, but it's getting ready to get worse. I have no doubt that some of those people sitting there probably started to cry. I mean, after all they've already been through, and they start to hear it's about to get worse, and maybe they hug each other a little bit closer. I have no doubt when this letter was read on the Lord's Day to the gathered church at Smyrna, their reaction was probably less than excited. The reality is, though, God doesn't, and I need to stress this, God doesn't always rescue His people like He did Paul and Silas. Sometimes what God does for His glory is, rather than rescuing His people, He allows His people the privilege to lay down their life for Him. And I use the word allow intentionally because it is a high honor to die for the name of Jesus. Remember the one that we looked at that was the perfect man, the one with skin like bronze and perfectly white hair, the eyes that were on fire, this one that was wearing the robes and the sash of the high priest. As we looked at this perfect man, think about his beauty, think about his glory, think about just how desirable he is, and then think about what a privilege it would be to literally spill your blood for the one who spilled his for you. I personally believe, whether it's sooner or later, difficult days are coming for the American church. A few years ago, in fact, it wasn't this last presidential election, but the one before, one person running for president actually said to a meeting of Planned Parenthood, it's recorded, I don't have to make these things up, if Christians will not get in line, they will have to change their mind, whether by their own choice or whether by political force. We're not suffering persecution, but if things don't change, the day's probably coming. And that word alone, you think about it, Jesus says this to the church. I mean, that's kind of bleak. That word alone would leave us in a cloud of doom and gloom. However, the prophecy may be bleak. I want you to see the promise is bright. Number 4, look with me finally this morning at the promise. Remember, the Smyrnans were proud of their faithfulness to Rome, but Christ promises something lasting to those who are faithful to Him. The end of verse 10 says, be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. In this Roman context, the crown was a common image to the Smyrnans. You've seen the pictures. Woven wreaths were placed on the head of the victor in the Olympian and the Isthmus Games. The last man standing, the one who won the race, this was the one who got the crown. To have the crown was a sign of honor. But the thing is, these crowns, if you've ever seen them, they're literally just leaves and sticks woven together. They're so temporary. In fact, after it's placed on your head, within a day or two, it begins to grow, to wilt and to grow dry and brittle. Think about this. Not one of the crowns given to the victors at any Olympic Games in this time still exists today. It's dust. They've all dried, they've all rotten, they've all wasted away. Yet Jesus' words to those who are about to die for Him is, you be faithful and I will give you a living crown, a crown that never fades. In this world, you can get a crown that's going to die. I will give you a crown that will always live. May I say to you this morning, the cross to every believer here, and I know this is not the message where you're going to leave here thinking, man, it was so nice to be in church today. But this is the reality, and if I don't tell you the reality of the days to come, whether it's in 10 years or 100 years, things are going to change in the world to fulfill the word of Christ. Things must change, and when they do, the church will suffer. And if I as a shepherd don't prepare you for that, I've not done my role, I've not done my work. And I want to say to you this morning, the cross always precedes the crown. There is no such thing as a crossless Christian. Even for Jesus, the crown of thorns preceded the crown of life, and we must not miss that Christ visited the grave before He experienced the resurrection. Following Christ may one day mean hanging on a cross literally for us, but to every believer who faces martyrdom, Jesus says, you be faithful to me in death, and I'll be faithful to you after death. Let me ask you, what real threat is death to one who's been united with the one who was dead but is alive forevermore? What torment is there in getting to go home early? For us, death is only an off-key prelude. Eternity is the real symphony. Jesus closes this letter with his final words, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And remember, this isn't just to these people. He says, he who has an ear, let him hear. Everybody that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. Some may say the martyrs, they had so much to live for. Can I say to you, I think the martyrs got something that we miss, and it's that they had so much to die for. To the outsider, the city of Smyrna was a beautiful gem. The street that ran the course between the temples was even actually called, historically, a street of gold. But get this, those who lived in Smyrna knew the city was hiding a dirty little secret. When the city was built, the engineers failed to actually install or include any sort of drainage system. You remember, this is the pinnacle, the most beautiful city in Asia Minor, the crown jewel. But they had no drains. So every time a major rain came, the streets would flood with sewage and debris. Those who lived in Smyrna knew this. Several times a year, people living in Smyrna, for them it was like living next door to a sewage plant. Outsiders didn't know this, but the insiders did. Knowing that, even facing death, these Smyrnans were losing nothing and gaining everything. They were trading poverty for riches, pain for gain, and a false street of gold for a real one. To them, death wasn't a threat, it was a treat. Death was only a chauffeur sent to take them home to God. The word Smyrna, as I close, the word Smyrna actually means myrrh. Myrrh was, of course, used in ancient context for burial. It was a spice. Myrrh was produced by taking a thorny little bush and crushing it down to nothing. The sweet perfume that we call myrrh was only produced when the plant was crushed and became nothing. So it is, through the crushing of the saints, the aroma of Christ spreads across all the earth. I want to tell you one story as I close, but can I say this to you? We're talking about dying for Jesus one day, but I just want to be honest with you. We would be naive to think that we would die for Jesus one day if we're not living for Him now. B.J. Higgins is a name you've probably never heard. A book was written about his life and his death titled, I Would Die For You. He was saved at age 8. When I say he was saved, I don't mean he made a decision. I mean he actually trusted Jesus and was born again. It was so evident because he, as an 8-year-old, began to tell everybody he knew about Jesus. He believed later on as he grew that he was called to Morocco as a missionary. He would often tell his sister, one day we'll go to Morocco together and we'll win the Moroccans to Christ. At 15, BJ went on a missions trip to Peru, and while he was there, he contracted a a disease, some sort of infection. He came back home and they treated him. They treated him for about 6 months, and at the end of 6 months he died. And man, and from the outside looking in, you think, God, what in the world are you doing? A 15-year-old boy who's giving you everything is willing to go to one of the most dangerous places in the world to spread the gospel, Morocco, and you let him die? Some would say, what a waste. After his cremation, the family took BJ's ashes to Morocco. They climbed a little hill and offered a prayer of dedication. They took his ashes and they cast them into the Moroccan wind. The place where they spread his ashes was on the top of a hill, and it overlooked a little Muslim village down below. They stopped, they offered a prayer of dedication. They thanked God for BJ and his life, and they moved on. What they later found out was their Muslim tour guide was so impacted by BJ's story that he actually became a Christian. Today, that Muslim tour guide is the pastor of an underground church in that same little village we just talked about. Morocco, now this is what I want you to understand, Morocco is closed to the gospel. You cannot go into Morocco with the express purpose, if the government knows it, of taking the gospel. Morocco is closed to the gospel. BJ could have never gotten in as a missionary, but God was able to take him there in an urn and literally bring beauty from the ashes. When we are willing to become ashes for the sake of Christ, then God can spread His fragrance through us. Until we're willing to die for Christ, I don't know if we can really ever say that we're living for Christ. I call you this morning to count yourself dead to this world and alive to Christ, not just in the future, but now, because martyrdom is no threat to the man or the woman who's already dead. These are the remains. You see the spray paint on these walls. These are the remains of the Acropolis in the city of Smyrna. The great jewel, the thing of beauty. They're nothing now but marked stones marked by graffiti. The kingdoms of this world fade. The cities of this world fall. It all fades. It all passes away. But Jesus promises to the one who overcomes by laying himself down, Jesus promises he will never be touched by the second death. If the day ever comes when we are privileged to lay down our life for Christ, may we remember the cities of this world fall and fade, but the next world lasts forever. The crown goes to the overcomer, and the overcomer is the one who willingly lays his life down. Will you pray with me?